Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being.
Welcome to the 270th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast, and happy 2025. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about what I think workplace wellbeing trends for 2025 will be. But firstly, I'll be reflecting on my predictions for 2024, which I have to say were quite accurate. And don't forget, the podcast is now fortnightly. But if you're missing weekly content, you have 5 years worth to reflect back on. And if you want my handy guide that lists the episodes with a clickable link, you can get it at bit.ly/DMPG23. So I really like to make predictions based on the present and see what happens. This year has been a bit more tricky. I don't feel it's been that clear to kind of predict. Still, things feel a bit up in the air. But in 2024, I said the trends would be firstly, intergenerational understanding. Due to the range of priorities, expectations, and experiences that employees bring to the workplace is wider than ever, because potentially we've got 5 generations working side by side. We have some, depending on the workplace sector, we do have some silent generations still working with, of course, Gen Z, and a huge range of differences in between there as well. And I think there has been a lot more discussion about that, actually, and a lot of conversations about, what we do. And that's definitely coming to the forefront. I've seen quite a few webinars taking place on that topic. And lots of conversations about how do we get different generations in our workplace to talk to one another or to understand each other. The second thing I said was about a decline in equality, diversity, and inclusion conversations, especially as they relate to the race equality. And so I think that was definitely happening. I feel that it did go silent. You could hear a pin drop. And then interestingly, the fascist riots shifted this slightly. So there was a bit more of movement and statements coming out from certain organizations, and people contacting me and other colleagues and saying, we really need to do some work on this. But then there's been no real change and no real support for global majority staff. And if you want to know more, do check out my episode, Still Too Scared to Talk About Race. The third thing I mentioned was about climate chaos, injustice, and supporting staff with mental health, family and friends who were in situations related to climate chaos and injustice. And it's much more than just playing lip service. And actually, if you want to know more about that, check out episode 193, Climate Change and Anxiety, 194 with Jelly May Maring about Parents for Future, 195, Colonial Legacies and Climate Change with Irene Asua, episode 196, How Divestment Links to Mental Health, and episode 206, Making Climate Justice Accessible with Pooja Tilvavala. So I think, again, we have definitely seen more discussions about that, more information about climate, a little bit of greenwashing here and there, but I think there have been some tiny steps towards divestment in certain pockets, and some organizations have really committed to this. And I do think there has been a little bit more partnering with different organizations around climate injustice. The fourth one I said was apps for wellbeing and integrating AI into the wellbeing process. I've definitely seen this. It's everywhere. There are lots of new companies that have sprung up with specific apps using AI to support staff, or supposedly support staff with their wellbeing. And the conversation really, I think, in mainstream workplaces around AI just feels like it's starting. So it's interesting. And I think many of you all know my opinion that, yes, it's one part of a package of tools, but I think AI replacing people that have healthy working environments it's not really the answer. And my fifth thing that I predicted, or I talked about, was about menopause, particularly around cases. As the working age increases, there's no default retirement age. And of course, menopause can happen at any time in someone's life, but the likelihood is more likely to happen at late 40s, early 50s, although, people go through early menopause for a number of reasons. But I think we definitely saw more discussion about this. Now, you could argue and say, well, because of America and the kind of drug culture there, the privatized medical industry, that there's been more talk about menopause because it has a commercial value now, which I would completely agree with. But I think it has been interesting to see the cases that have been coming through the employment tribunals. Not all of them have results, but that people are taking their cases to employment tribunals, and the symptoms and the experiences that some people have when they're going through menopause. And of course, it's a period of time. It doesn't just happen overnight, are covered under the Equality Act, under disability, in terms of the impact of the symptoms. So that's really interesting. And I think a lot more discussion. And of course, as always, if you want to know more, do check out my episode, Black Women in Menopause, with the brilliant Nina Kuipers. So I think it's really useful to consider where we are in terms of well-being, the state of the nation, if you like, and what we might be seeing. I think it's very difficult to predict because, again, we are still in a VUCA environments, so volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So workplaces are going to have to change, adapt, and respond to this. Some are going to be much more agile. And interestingly, I think smaller organizations do this much better than larger organizations, but it's still having to happen. And for me, I think 2024 was definitely a year of two halves, because as soon as the UK elections were announced, and they were kind of snap, I mean, those in the know probably knew they were coming, the inquiries and the requests really started to ramp up. And then with the Labour win, that continued. But then I think it's going to be interesting, because we can look at opinion polls for Labour. And according to Ipsos Mori in September 24, it showed that 54% of pollers were dissatisfied with Keir Starmer. So that's an incredibly short honeymoon period, if they even really had one. But given Labour's manifesto about making work pay, this is going to be interesting. I don't think all of it has to be legislated for, but it looks like we might have certain codes of practice. It depends. Don't really know. And you know, I'm not an employment lawyer, so I just check things on various sector sites. But I think one of the things that's really shocking is the increase in hate crime. So we've seen a significant increase in reported, so I should say reported hate crime. So the number that must go unreported, this figure has really shot up. So in 2023-24, there were 140,561 hate crimes reported in England and Wales. Northern Ireland and Scotland do it slightly differently. And this is a significant increase from the 11 years previously. So 2012, 2013, there were 42,255. Now, you could argue that when people know more, they know their rights, they're more likely to report things, absolutely. And that often when we put things in place, there will be a spike. So any of you who've put in bullying hotlines into your workplace knows that there should be an increase before there's a decrease. And our populations increase as well. We've got different rhetoric, but to me, that's a horrific amount. And the most common type of hate crime reported was racism, with 98,799 incidents. And then the second most common was sexual orientation, with 22,839 incidents. So this is terrifying. And we know that with these high numbers, we are going to be having people who have experienced hate crimes working as our colleagues, as our friends, as managers. And so we really, really need to think about this. And this is why, you know, I say workplace wellbeing trends, and they are trends because they do shift from year to year. But how do we use this information to really make an improved workplace? And again, as always with stress is not going anywhere, sadly. So it's thought that work is the most common cause of stress, with 79% of people being affected by work-related stress. And the average adult says that they feel stressed for almost a third of their working day, which is a significant amount of time. Health and safety executive, around 17 million working days are lost every year because of ill health caused by work stress, depression, or anxiety. This is over 50% of all work-related ill health cases. And 19% of UK workers say their employer has put no measures in place to relieve workplace stress, which really surprises me, because given the amount of information that there is, you could just type in, how do I relieve workplace stress as a manager? And you get loads and loads of information. But I really hope you're enjoying the content of this podcast and want to keep up to date. If you are, then join my newsletter. When you join my mailing list, you receive a free copy of my ebook, The Mentally Healthy Leading Manager. And that link is bit.ly/MHLMEBKLNK. So what do I think then the trends for 2025 will be? And as I said, this has been much trickier than previous years, actually. I found it much easier to sort of predict, and I've had a look at other sources, and a lot of it seems very generic. But I'm going to start off with something I wish I didn't have to. And I'm going to say the first thing is going to be redundancy support for people. And I don't mean the kind of statutory legal requirements. I mean the sort of and not the negotiations necessarily or the consultation process. I mean the support that it has on people's mental well-being. And it's really sad, because I heard and saw many people being made redundant prior to Christmas, which made me really angry, actually, because in some cases it was not necessary. And I would say a lot of it was being driven by the increase in employers' NI costs. So that was in the budget, the autumn budget. And I think there will have to be redundancy support in terms of transition coaching, support for maybe people who need to find a new job, so CV support. It could also be that people will need to be supported because AI might be responsible for some of it. So it might be more in the manual sectors or physical jobs, but also other jobs seem to be pushing onto the horizon. Marketing, communications, not completely. So how staff will need support with this, or in fact to work with AI or their jobs roles changing. So ensuring that your employee assistance program, if you have one, is up to date with this, working with the right transition coaches and career coaches and CV support to get people into the best place they can be. as they're being made redundant, as well as all of the consultation and the legal frameworks and the things that you have to do. So, yeah, that's not a nice one to start off with. And I know there's pushback around, well, the government didn't really have much choice. But I feel that, for the third sector, this is absolutely catastrophic. Now, I know of charities that have to make £1.8 million worth of cuts, which is, of course, a lot of people's jobs. So this isn't going to be a particularly easy time. All right. So the second thing, kind of maybe linked to this, because we're going to have fewer staff left once people have been through a redundancy process, is the right to switch off. Also known as burnout blocking. So, the right to switch off is currently a proposed law that would give employees the right to decline work related communication outside of their regular working hours. Now, interestingly, this shouldn't really need to be a law in my eyes, but I can see why it does have to be. And I think in the Labour manifesto, they talked about Spain and France's approach to this. And it's a real shame that it has to go down this route. I mean, the right to switch off should be in your email signature. Of course, we all have to answer things at certain times. Occasionally, it does happen. I think this regularity of it, I think the blurred boundaries from lockdown and working at home and thinking, oh, just carry on working because we're in a lockdown, haven't really helped it. But the right to switch off would prevent employees from being contacted out of hours, except in exceptional circumstances. So this actually would include phone calls, emails, instant messages, which I think are really problematic, and any other forms of communication. Of course, letters take a while to get there. So I guess not letters, but the right to switch off, it's thought, could be implemented through a code of practice. So the code could restrict contacting employees out of hours and acknowledge the right to disconnect. So I think personally, more discussion around this at work, in workplaces, cultural expectations is great and would mean that people can switch off and be more productive when they're at work. I've also seen the phrase burnout blocking being used, and I think this is a really interesting one. It's a kind of reframe for organizations, i.e. we're preventing burnout before it becomes a huge issue, before people are going off sick, before we get a bad reputation. So you might hear the phrase burnout blocking. Of course, that's not going to be the legal definition. If you want to know more about identifying and combating burnout, check out episode 114, all about that subject. The third area for me, and again, it's been an interesting one. I feel there's been very little conversation about disability in the workplace, which of course makes me really angry. But I think there is going to have to be more of a focus this year on workplace adjustments, or as I know in the law, reasonable adjustments. But I call them workplace adjustments because what happens is workplaces think it's what I think is reasonable. No, it's what is you have to do to accommodate someone. It's, most workplace adjustments for disability support are not onerous. So it's thought that there are 2.8 million people aged 16 to 64 out of the workforce in the UK due to long-term health problems. And 3.7 million people are in employment but dealing with a work-limiting health condition. Now, if we think about the fact that we still haven't addressed long COVID symptoms, how people have developed secondary conditions, it's really, really frightening. And so sickness does cost a lot. And, I say a lot, we're looking at the billions. We're looking at about 103 billion is thought to have cost in 2024. Now, that's great if we want to make a financial case to, all sectors across the UK. But I think, this is really important that people want to work. And so why aren't we creating environments for them where they can work in the way that they need to? And those stats that I just read out are from Westfield Health. The link is in the show notes, Wellbeing Trends for 2025. So I did have a look at that. The rest of them, have a look yourself. If you want to have a look yourself, because I didn't necessarily agree with the rest of them. But there is going to have to be responsibility for employee health by employers, especially if we're looking at redundancies, we're looking at fewer people left, we're looking at this kind of the right to switch off. I think, I think reasonable adjustment and wellbeing policies have to be interlinked and interwoven because, of course, if someone doesn't have their workplace adjustments, they're not going to be great at work, they're not going to feel great. And so this is about preventative support, and this also includes neurodivergent conditions. So absolutely making sure that workplace adjustments are put into place in a timely and seamless way. And for me, that is about asking questions when someone has got the job. You just say, do you have any adjustments? Do you have any workplace adjustments? Have you had them before? Having those conversations, recording it, making sure the line manager is aware, training, and putting them in a timely place, having work needs assessors that you use, that you know and trust and do a good job. That's really important. And, the waiting list for access to work is really, really long at the moment. So 9 months, that is not realistic. So we can get people on the access to work, but in the meantime, we need another way, or workplaces need another way to ensure that someone has their workplace report and managers are aware of what they're needed. And so everyone can hit the ground running. And I think that's going to be really essential. And if you want to know more, check out episode 120, Having Conversations About Workplace Adjustments. Then the fourth thing for me is around managing differences of opinions when it comes to local and global politics. So getting very comfortable with discomfort. From Reform UK, Trump's election, Musk's mouthing off, a global genocide, this impacts staff members' well-being in a huge way. And it's natural for people to talk about things or comments slip out in the workplace that are not necessarily kind or helpful in many cases. There may be people who support reform, and I think that's a really interesting one because, of course, they are a legitimate political party. Although many of the things they said are going to be quite incendiary, quite painful and discriminatory. So this really is going to be a key wellbeing pillar and one that workplaces need to consider very carefully. So the continual confrontation and discrimination that we see on a daily basis in the media is going to affect the mental health of impacted communities. So thinking about how do we give employees and colleagues the flexibility and space to deal with the news or to talk about what's going on for them, in a way that doesn't then trigger other people is going to be very interesting. And this is an essential part of providing support. And I don't think things are going anywhere. And we talked about this VUCA world, and it is very volatile. And of course, if we then say, be your authentic self, bring yourself to work, how are we managing all of this? So I will go back to the point around bring your best professional self to work, which I've taken from the wonderful Jonathan Ashong-Lamptey. He talks a lot about this in his podcast, Element of Inclusion. So do check that out. And I think it is about that. So what are the parameters? We're not trying to be policing people's speech, but we do need to think about how do we ensure that people are being respectful to one another's, what are the parameters? And if someone is triggered, what are the mechanisms that we have those discussions so that people feel supported and can hear both sides? Not always easily done. And if you want to know more, do check out episode 254. Is it okay to talk about politics at work? Finally, I think the thing I'm going to finish with, and I think it links to the first point, is economic uncertainty is really highlighted. And it's been going on for a long time, really, hasn't it? The importance of financial well-being. So I think that organizations are really going to have to look at the financial support. And I think that is tricky because if you're making redundancies and then saying to people, oh, we've got this workshop about how to manage your money, it does feel a bit like a kick in the teeth. But are there ways that this can be done proactively, regularly available, so it doesn't look like it's a reflex response to redundancies? But it is about things like financial literacy workshops, helping people save. Are there certain things that you can do? Obviously, in the financial industry, there might be certain perks and certain plans that you can give your staff that are not available to the general public. Debt management support, taking the shame away from that. And I think it's also about measuring the effectiveness of these initiatives and encouraging people to access them because they often don't feel that they're confidential. So how that needs to be managed, because addressing financial stress is going to improve individual well-being, productivity, and focus. But talking about money is really difficult. So that's going to be an interesting one, but I think it's going to have to happen. And there's a very good, another future work employee wellbeing trends. I've put in the LinkedIn post that Engaging Africa has written, which I think is a really, really great example of different areas. And if you want to know more about monitoring, evaluation, and inclusion workplace mistakes, do check out episode 188. This is a phrase I'm going to use, a bit of a movable feast with 2025. So as always, it's about starting with the end in mind. What are your predictions? Have you got your PESTLs? Have you got your SWOT analysis? What are you doing with the VUCA framework? So in your workplace and your team or your organization, what is really pressing for you and therefore tailoring options to your staff? What's worked in the past is not necessarily likely to work in the same way. So what needs to be adapted and changed? And of course, things are constantly changing. It's really difficult to keep up with things, I think. Staff wellbeing isn't going anywhere and still needs attention. And in fact, in the UK, business confidence has actually fallen to its lowest level in 2 years as output drops sharply. So business confidence has been at its weakest, and this is from December 2024, since January 23, as businesses face rising costs, reduced consumer confidence, and falling orders. And the output index recorded its lowest reading in more than a year, despite golden apparently Christmas quarter, driven by declines across both services and manufacturing sectors. Employment falls again after breaking a continuous 15-month decline in October as businesses, so that's October 2024, as businesses face mixed signals on fiscal and monetary policy. So I think this might have been just before the budget. So this is taken from a piece from BDO, the accountancy firm BDO, and I've put the link in the show notes for you. And business optimism has dropped across the UK to its lowest in nearly 2 years as companies grapple with rising costs, reduction in orders, and ongoing challenges in the labour market. So it's not going to be easy. And I think that as a result, human to human contact is still absolutely essential, and AI cannot replace that. And specific challenges, as we've seen with global wars, injustice, climate chaos, these really do have to be paid attention to. I haven't even touched on carers leave, maternity and paternity, all of that, which is still definitely there. I feel like there may be some shifts. I mean, there are going to have to be more conversations about social care. The review's just been announced, which is going to take 3 years, which isn't particularly helpful. So, changing workplace demographics also need to be explored. So I'd love to hear from you as always. What are your workplace wellbeing predictions and trends? What do you think is going to happen? And don't forget, if you want support on any of the mental health and wellbeing, things around hate crime, I run workshops, training sessions, and keynotes for organizations about creating positive, happy, and equal workplaces. If you want to find out more, you can get in touch at Leyla, Leyla, at diverseminds.co.uk. And I really hope you've enjoyed today's show. And if you're a regular listener over the last 5 years, so please leave me a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast from. And if you want to leave me a voice note, please do so on SpeakPipe. The link is bit.ly/SPKPDMP, and you can leave your name or not. And don't forget my TEDx talk. You can watch that in your break, as it's just 12 minutes long, exploring the connection between culture, race, and mental health. And that link is bit.ly/TEDxWOLVESLO. And if you enjoy it, please comment, like, and leave a positive comment on YouTube. And don't forget to connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Blue Sky. And join me in 2 weeks' time, where I'll be talking more about top workplace inclusion and mental health content. Until then, take care, everyone, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.